Also, just for the record, just so you have it, the LPL team has not been able to talk to the smart contract team about liquidations 2.0. And this is the first time we were able to talk, and we're just doing it publicly just because of the legal restrictions that legal put on us. So if you don't, please don't, if you have any criticisms of you or whatever, please don't take it personally, because we had to do this in the public forum, according to legal.
Yeah,
But
that's okay.
we have great respect for everybody here. So
We'll keep a thick skin on. Yeah, and I will mention that any sort of feedback that we get now is sort of critically important. We're shooting for code complete within the coming weeks, so we really would value any sort of feedback, and if there's going to be last minute tweaks, they're going to happen during this time period. So now's the time to speak. Is Kurt back?
Yeah, I'm back. Seems like I didn't say anything important while I was off. Not that I was necessarily saying much of importance ever, but yeah, really excited to have so many people on this call to share their opinions, and we can get as much into the weeds as you want. Nothing is off limits here. So maybe with that said, yeah, is there anything somebody wants to dive into right from the start?
I actually have a list of questions to go through, but I was wondering if you wanted to provide everyone with an overview, or is it expected that everyone else on the call has already had a chance to review it and they're somewhat familiar with it?
Yeah, I hope that it was sort of clear that people should review the forum post and the technical summary prior to this. I think we should dive right in, and if you're lost because you haven't done that, just ask those questions and we'll try and give a broad stroke of the feature.
Yeah, I mean, I could show just 3 or 4 slides really quickly to just demonstrate how does a Dutch auction work or something like that, if that would be useful, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on just trying to communicate the information. The idea was that people would come prepared.
Sure, so I'm happy to dive right into my first question if it's all right with everyone else.
Yes, please do.
Okay, let's hypothesize an attack where a single actor decides to, for a long period of time, bid at the very beginning of the Dutch auction. That's when the calculation function has produced a price that's probably unfavorable, right? If we assume that the calculation function starts at the OSM price and decreases, what happens if an actor comes in at the beginning of every auction and actually calls the take method for the entire lot size of the auction at an unprofitable price, with the angle that they want to discourage other participants, other actors from participating in liquidations? Is there any countermeasure for that?
So the presumed attack would be they would do this over some period of months. The ecosystem would basically dry up until they had sole control over the ecosystem, and then they'd start, allowing the sort of price decrease function to really drop and really drop and really drop until prices were so low they got a steal. So the sort of initial gut reaction to that, and then Kurt, maybe you want to chime in too at some point, but the hope is that we'll have integrations from other DEX aggregators and Web3 users that will be able to sort of see these auctions, so that you won't need this sort of heavy technical infrastructure in order to spin up a keeper, which is how you'd be expecting to get away with an attack like this. So our hope is that even if somebody does this, and even trains users to stay away from those UIs, that with a little bit of messaging, we end up with an easy way to attract a bunch of Web3 users, because there are deals, and then we also end up with hopefully if DEX aggregators are just integrated with them, we'll just sort of naturally get sort of mixed in with their user base. So when the price decrease function hits something and someone's looking to do a trade in that pair, it'll just show up on us and use us as a source for the liquidity.
So I'll say that, like it's very hard to prevent that sort of attack in general in any auction system, right? Like you can do that in the current auctions. And I think, as Chris was saying, it's probably a less severe attack in the new auction system because you can have those integrations. And like if it's a DEX aggregator that's just, you know, checking prices for people doing purchases of, you know, whatever the collateral type is, you know, and they're doing that check, you know, whenever somebody's trying to buy or sell particular collateral or, you know, asset types, you know, as you know, if they're just trying to pick out the best price, if suddenly this overbidder has stopped bidding, that's going to now show up as a good price, and hopefully those orders will get routed. You know, whereas in the current auction system, that's like not a possibility at all.
Okay, and my next question brings up something that Long for Wisdom discussed kind of before the call really started, involving front running. So I hypothesized that for any bidder who is bidding on more than half of the collateral up for auction at a time, if they get front run, that means that their bid would essentially be blocked because that liquidity wouldn't be there anymore as a result of the preceding call to the take function. I can't hypothesize any way that we could really protect against that, but maybe we could just have a discussion on it and some of the mechanics of front running and how it's more of a game theory problem rather than an attack.
Yeah, well, one thing I'd say very quickly, even if they're bidding on more than half the liquidity, the way the new auctions are implemented are kind of like a limit order. So like you could say, hey, I want to buy all the collateral. And if somebody buys out 75% of it before your order gets there, you'd still get 25%. Of course, that doesn't totally mitigate the attack because maybe the front runner just buys it all, right? But you know, it's, you know, you sort of optimistically specify this is the maximum amount of collateral I would be willing to buy, and you'll get up to that amount, but possibly less.
Right, and I'd be careful to characterize it as a limit order because you're not really, you're placing like an upper limit on quantity, not price. So it's a bit different than like a limit order.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a trading background, so my terminology might be a little imprecise here, but it's, yeah, you specify an upper bound on the amount of collateral you want to buy.
Right. Okay. So in the example where, let's say both participants bid 55%, right? The front runner would get their 55%. And even though you bid for 55% of the collateral, you get 45% if you were front run and there were no other actors.
Right.
Yeah, and then for mitigating front running, you know, there's for keepers that are going to implement bots that do this, there's any number of strategies that they can try and employ like on their side to do it. But we have no specific front running protections in the new Liquidations 2.0 code. And I think that's primarily because there's, you know, I think we all converged on a similar idea, but that idea came with trade-offs that that seemed maybe worse than the front running problem.
Well, to be very specific, the trade-off seemed to be that any viable front running defense seems to mess up single block composability to some extent. You know, like you have to either in a private or public way, for example, pre-commit to say buying at a certain price. And then, you know, since you've pre-established those rights, you can't be front run, but that presents all sorts of integration problems.
I'm a little confused. Like, what is the purpose of the front runner? Like, what advantage does the front runner get?
Well, the idea of front running in general on Ethereum is you see a transaction that's going to be profitable. And so then you very quickly, before that transaction gets executed, resubmit the same or a similar transaction. And this can actually get quite detailed, where front runners will pick apart a transaction and reconstruct a new one that's very different, but then it takes advantage of the same arbitrage opportunity. You submit it with a higher gas price. The miners execute that transaction first, and then the original transaction sort of loses the gas auction for that, whatever the arbitrage opportunity was.
Yeah, it's basically like really quick intellectual property theft. You have a really great idea.
I mean, look, from our perspective, for this specific situation, or again, as a maker token holder, do we really care?
We only
mean-
care in so, as speaking in the royal we of maker token holders here, we really only care insofar as it might limit competitiveness of auctions and make debt recapitalization less likely in the long term because, a small number of front runners, for example, sort of drive down competition. But it's, like I was saying at the beginning, it's not really clear if this it gets classified as an attack per se. It's just the game theory, and if ultimately it's profitable enough to front run transactions, it means there's someone still trying to take advantage of those opportunities, and it may not really be an issue. Yeah, so that's sort of the whole philosophical game theory discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for this specific question, like, I don't think, again, when I say I and we, I'm thinking of the maker token holder as a community. Like, it doesn't, in some sense, it's like our bots beating other our bots, right? Like, as long as the maker token holder, gets, or the auction goes off well in terms of the maker token holder is not paying any collateral, that's what, at the end of the day, we mainly care about, right?
Yeah, first priority, recapitalize the system so that there's not unbacked DAI. Second priority is like return as much collateral to the, liquidated vault as the market allows for. And so, so long as the auctions are fulfilling those purposes, we're from an MKR perspective, that's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, like, as long as there's probably an arbitrage opportunity between Uniswap and Balancer and this potential auction, like, some ARBot should take advantage of it.
Okay, so it sounds like this is going to be an ongoing thread, right? And I think that there's a couple different ways, game theory-wise, that this issue can present itself, which is, just as we had answered in the first question, if there's an actor that is overbidding or locking the majority of participants out over time, that could disincentivize participants until there's no participants or very little participating. And I think that this will just come up again and again and again, but to your guys' point, I don't think it's a bug. I think it's just something that we'll have to deal with.
I mean, in dealing with it, if it proves to be a problem in practice, dealing with it could involve implementing a different auction system that, hampers front running in some way. But like we said, that will come along with trade-offs. Like, we currently don't know how to do that without spoiling single block composability, which throws out flash loans and DexAg integrations and stuff like that stuff.
That makes sense. So another potential attack that Akash hypothesized was let's say someone who comes to the game with a large amount of capital and is able to actually manipulate the price of ETH heavily. So Akash, did you want to go through this yourself, or would you like me to read
Yeah,
it?
I mean, I can hopefully explain it fairly fast. The basic theory behind this is, again, this would be most likely when, there's some kind of market event and, the market is already kind of weak, but some extremely large player could essentially, take the major exchanges that indices are based out of. So typically, most ETH indices are based off of Coinbase, Kraken, and Bitstamp, for example. So this attacker would short on those three exchanges. Like, so he would accumulate a bunch of ETH. He would start selling the ETH on those three exchanges, which would affect futures index values. He would simultaneously go on Bybit or BitMEX or whatever other futures exchanges exist, start selling ETH futures down there, and essentially build up a large negative short position in futures and actually have sold out his existing ETH spot position. So now that he has a big short, he still drives down the market, and he is able to do this for over an hour. So currently, like let's say ETH is trading at 390, he's able to drive down the price all the way to 300 or 280 and keep it down there for an hour. The Oracle updates, let's say the Oracle updates to, I don't know, 310, but this triggers a bunch of auctions. And then the large manipulator pays the OSM price and essentially buys a big block down at a much lower price. And to be fair, like this manipulator is buying this ETH block positions at the OSM price and at a higher price than the actual value that ETH is trading at. And when I mean trading at, let's say whatever the price is, the ETH time market is trading at, let's say at Uniswap or Balancer. So what the manipulator has effectively done is he's triggered auctions and he's used the large liquidity of the maker auctions to close out his short position.
So just to make sure I understand, the attack is push down prices on these centralized exchanges that feed into the Oracle data for maker. At the same time, maybe have a big short position open. Then liquidations happen. The design does include a configurable buffer above the current OSM price for whatever the starting price of the auction is. That basically is increasing the size of the attack in the sense that to have that, whatever target price this attacker needs at the start, they have to push it down by that much more, but it's a difference of, quantity, not quality, I suppose you would say. Yeah. And then, buy cheaply and cover the short position. Do I understand that?
Yeah, I mean, the reason he's targeting Maker and the Maker Oracles is it triggers a bunch of very large auctions. So normally you could say, well, the attacker could do this normally, but the advantage of attacking Maker is he can buy a very large amount of ETH at these depressed prices.
So a couple of things get in the way there with the new design. One is there's this limit on the amount of debt that can go to auction at any given time. So that
so
obviously has to be
only like $15 million is your claim. Is that right?
Well, it's set by parameters are recommended by the risk team and voted on by governance. So it's currently 15 million. So that would be one thing that would prevent the necessarily the profitability of this if that's set low enough where the attacker can't get the collateral that he needs, the ETH or whatever, to cover those positions. So that's sort of bounds the size of the attack, or the attack has to go on longer because he has to depress the price for longer on those exchanges.
Yep.
And there's also an element of where anybody can bid in these auctions. So even if he's trying to buy at that depressed price, everybody else will want to buy at that depressed price as well. So there's risk in that he might not necessarily win the priority gas auction, for example, although presumably he has a larger financial stake in that than anyone else, so he would bid very high.
Right. So to be clear, I'm not completely clear on the whole auction mechanism, but in this case, he's willing to pay a higher price than fair market value at that time. So that's why he has a higher probability of grabbing the entire 15 million. So to that point, let's say he buys the entire 15 million, right? Does the auction mechanism then release a new 15 million?
Yes.
So then he does have access to a very large amount if he's willing to pay above market prices.
Yeah, it's a bit more involved, but so it's not instantaneous. But yeah, there would. But
well, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
This guy's a whale, right? Like he doesn't need flash loans and anything. He's just
I mean, he'd implement a new buffer like every time he got to the cap and he won a lot. It would start off new auctions, but it'd be above that market price again, and then continue to fall. So he's got to wait some period of time until it's at the OSM price. I did want to interject one.
Well, that was what I was saying. He would just push the price down far enough where he could buy right at the cap, so it increases the cost of the attack.
So my next comment will also partly address this. It's not necessarily, it steps back from the auctions and just says that the whale in this case doesn't really know how many of those vaults are available for liquidation at that price. They can only conjecture because a number of those vaults are going to be protected by automation like DeFi Saver. So there's no guarantee that it's even like easy to sort of estimate what you can liquidate. You know, in certain tiers, maybe there's more, but I mean, we don't know that. You know, I doubt the attacker would know that. So that's an additional protection on top of this.
Well,
So-
but that's public blockchain data, right? They can just see
Yeah.
how much is
They
liquidated.
can
at
see
what
like
level.
large cliffs of where, you know, you need to drive down prices theoretically.
Yeah, you could see that, and then you'd have to wonder. I mean, like I've been impressed with some of the pullbacks we've had lately by how little or almost no liquidations we got during some of those pullbacks, because so many people are tooled up, at least on the very edge near the price. They're tooled up with like DeFi Saver or some other automation that balances their collateralization ratio. So I do think there's a number. I think there's a price there where we could say this attack is definitely going to be viable.
Well, and I think there's some governance parameters to talk about, and one of them isn't really a parameter, it's just a variable in the equation, and that's the OSM delay, right? So essentially in this hypothesized attack, that delay would be about 2 hours, right? Because you'd have to depress the price enough for an hour to actually get the low OSM price, and then you'd have to wait until the next one rolls off for the liquidations to happen on it. So yeah, I mean, the actor would need a large amount of collateral, or a large reserves in order to be able to commit such an attack.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few angles to think about, you know, reducing the risk from an attack like this. One is, you know, making sure the attack is costly, which includes things like the OSM delay itself. It includes the buffer on top of the OSM price that's applied to the initial price of the auction. You know, it includes things like how competitive are the auctions in the open market, so that the, you know, attacker's not guaranteed to win. And then you can talk about doing things like improving the Oracle system to manipulation, right? Because you can Oracle attack the system, you know, already, and we do have mitigations for that. For example, you know, if governance realizes in time that a manipulation is going on these exchanges to try to affect the next Oracle price, you know, there is a freeze mechanism that can be triggered without going through the governance delay. And, you know, I agree that that's not a perfect mitigation, but it does exist, because you know, you can already attack the system in this way. And, you know, well, maybe not the specific attack, but through Oracle.
Right. So I guess the way to categorize this attack is if you see the auctions going off at prices that are above fair market value, right? That's a signal that something strange is going on.
Fair market value is defined by the Oracle.
No, fair market value is a live price. So whatever.
You mean below? Then you mean below fair market value, right?
No. So let's say like ETH DAI is trading at 300, and this guy is willing to pay 320, when he could easily buy ETH at Uniswap at 300. The reason he's willing to pay 320 is because he can get access to extremely large size through the maker auction.
So he
Oh,
actually,
wait, if
it's removing the slippage. Is that the hack?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, it's converting a shallow order book price to a gigantic order on Maker. That's the hack, right?
Right. The advantage of that Maker, the advantage that Maker gives to him is the fact that he has extremely large liquidity coming online, right? The fact that he can buy extremely large blocks of ETH at 320 is the reason for this attack.
Right. So the way that you could, I mean, technically speaking, that would be very difficult, but in theory, the way that you could mitigate it is to not just look at the market price, but also at the market depth and liquidity available, and then say, well, if it's this much, that will be up for auction, then actually the price is higher.
Yeah, I didn't understand what you're trying to say, Wouter. Can you say it a different way?
Basically, we have a buffer on top of that current price. I think Wouter is suggesting instead of that buffer being some offset from the OSM price, it's the offset from the OSM price plus some function that factors in like market depth for that particular asset.
Yeah, and I would argue that the extra buffer above the OSM price, to choose that value, risk should probably consider the scenario that was outlined here. So that that value should reflect the market depth. The more shallow the market, the higher that number should be.
Yeah, I fully agree. If it's mana, the buffer should be really high. And if it's F, it doesn't need to be as large, right? Is that basically what you're saying, Wouter?
Yeah, but frankly, isn't that just a general thing? Like we already do that, right? Because if you have that amount of, if you have that liquidity, you simply you put it in a vault, and you take out the DAI loan, and we're already like transferring from an illiquid asset to liquid debt, right? So yeah, I don't know if this is something specific to the auctions even.
Well, I could try to bring it back to talking about the auctions in particular, because I wanted to talk about the calc function and some of the governance parameters. The first one I wanted to get into is the whole, right? So
right before we jump into this, I just want to say one last thing on that whole previous discussion, which is there is a mitigation we could consider adding if the risk is great enough, which is you could add some like hard cap on the amount liquidated, per time. Right now it's just the cap on how much can be at auction at a time, but you could also say like, you're not allowed to liquidate more than 15 million or 5% of the total DAI supply or whatever per hour or something like that. So I'll just say that would probably need more offline discussion, but just to make sure we don't miss that.
I would even argue that if you have an illiquid asset, then the debt ceiling should be low enough so that it's not possible to ever liquidate the amounts that we're talking about, because otherwise you're creating the exact same risk on the side of simply taking out the DAI loan, right? Like suppose that I own like 90% of all tokens of an illiquid asset, and the very shallow market price is some almost random number. Well, if the debt ceiling is high enough, I just can lock it in, and sure, maybe I'll have to pay like a 50% premium because the liquidation ratio is 150%. But then still, that would be much more than what I would get from the market, because there's simply my liquidity would drive the market to zero, right? So I think this one really comes down to setting the right risk parameters.
And I would argue continuous monitoring of the liquidity to adjust those risk parameters going forward.
Yeah, ideally this would all be like automated, but we'll get there eventually.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, Ed. Didn't mean to interrupt you there.
That's okay. I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on whole, because in the forum post it discussed that there was both an overall limit on the amount of DAI that needed to be recovered that's out for auction simultaneously, but it also said that there was going to be a collateral type specific one. And in the source code, I only found the overall whole. I didn't find an an auction, a collateral specific hole?
I'd check the latest version of the code because that has been added.
Okay.
Make sure you're just it's the LIQ-2.0 branch in DSS, and the latest version of that should have that per collateral hole type, which, you know, governance doesn't have to use if it doesn't want to, but, you know, we sort of like to err on the side of adding levers if we're not sure whether we need them or not, because it's very hard to add them after the fact.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay.
And I'm almost convinced we'll need this lever because of something like mana. So we may need to cap mana, you know. Again, Wouter's probably right. The DC should be the first line of defense, but the second defense would be how much we allow to be liquidated at once. We certainly wouldn't want 15 million, the entire amount of mana going out for liquidation.
So on that note, considering having different holes for different collateral types, what about the calc function? When we choose the calc function, that's part of the clip contract itself, and that's going to be different for each collateral type. So does that imply that we'd likely have the risk team determine which calc function is most appropriate for the collateral type, and we could have different calc functions for each collateral?
Yes, absolutely. That's the idea. And I mean, maybe when we actually deploy these for like gas cost reasons, we won't do it as an external contract and we'll build it right into the clips. But you know, right now it's intentionally modular that, you know, we want to be agnostic about, you know, what is the best function per collateral type. And you might want to be able to swap it in and out even for a given collateral type based on market conditions. So, you know, that's still very much an active area of research of what are the best, you know, price decrease functions for different collaterals on a blockchain.
Okay, when we released Liquidations 1.2, I believe it was the risk team who kind of helped determine what an initial set of parameters would be for initial deployment. And then it was just a yay or nay vote to actually enable Liquidations 1.2. Is that going to be the same process for Liquidations 2.0, or are we going to try to send these parameters out for like a separate vote?
Good question. I don't know that there's any firm plan there yet.
I'd certainly prefer if governance can have more input than just signing off with yes or no.
I think we have a ticket to basically aggregate all of the tunables that are in Liquidations 2.0, and we were going to hand that off to Risk so that they knew what they should sort of think about. Maybe we can add into that process that they bubble that set of parameters up to governance, and maybe votes on so governance can vote on a package or something like that as well.
I mean, you know, I would say this sort of like, how does, you know, once the technical work is done, how does that flow through the governance and risk apparatus and turn into executive votes on chain? That's sort of a broader discussion than what this call is intended for. And so, you know, it's obviously an important discussion that needs to happen. I would say the way to push that through would be to participate in the forums and governance calls. And if you're opinionated about how that should be done, like if there needs to be a separate vote for risk parameters, you know, give justification for that and go through that process.
I would also add here that we have the grant for Gauntlet, right? So they will be running some economic simulations that might also inform the choice of risk parameters. Sorry, I got someone off there.
Could you go into more detail on the Gauntlet integration?
Well, so Gauntlet, they're an economic blockchain modeling company. So they're going to be doing simulations of different market conditions with the full liquidation system. And, you know, they'll have like models of various ecosystem actors participating in that. And so, you know, you'll say compare it to different behaviors of price over time and different combinations of risk parameters, maybe even different mixes of participants. And they'll run a bunch of simulations and, you know, look and see like how often is full recapitalization achieved? What's the average value return to vaults? You know, like what are there any like catastrophic failure modes discovered? And, you know, obviously no simulation and modeling perfectly accounts for the real world, but the hope is that doing it is a lot better than just sort of being blind about how things might behave, and can inform better risk parameter settings. I think there's also intention, you know, once Gauntlet has sort of developed their simulation tool, you know, we'd like to make that, they can't open source it because it's proprietary technology, but it could be exposed as like a SaaS app that the community could then use going forward if they wanted to model under, you know, different price versus time curves or different risk parameters.
In these modeling events, do they model nefarious actors?
I'm certain that they can, right? They can, you know, they sort of like code up logic for, you know, different actor types. So that's probably something we can pursue with them.
My other question is, like, how is this going to be released? Like, is this like a bang release, like all the collaterals will kind of go into auction V2, or can it be staged where you can do a couple of collaterals and test out this new system in production for a couple months or something like that?
You know, that's still under discussion. I think the sort of current thinking is actually more around the gradual transition, just from the perspective of, you know, you don't want to introduce too drastic a change at once. You know, we also want to retain for sure the ability to switch back to the old auctions, at least for a period of time.
Getting back to Gauntlet, will their analysis be sufficiently detailed that they're emulating Ethereum network congestion and high gas prices?
Yeah, I believe that they do reach that level in their simulations, because they actually like run against full Ethereum nodes. So we'll make sure to ask them to cover those situations.
Okay, I think Lix had a question in the chat. Maybe they
Yeah,
can
Lix, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me? I think, yeah.
Yep.
Let me know if you can't. Okay, cool. It's more of a bit of feedback in another direction than on the previous point. Just something I've noticed with the price versus time curve. I think that's going to be the most important factor of this, to get tuned just right for the worst case scenario. So one worst case scenario I could see happening would be, let's say we have like 50 million, 70 million debt ceiling available, and all of a sudden the DAI price just crashes. Or not the DAI price, the ETH price, and all of our collateral other crashes, like, you know, black swan events. An attacker could have, or a team of attackers, because you have multiple people do this attack, would be like have the whale attacker part of it draw out a lot of debt ceiling and fill up all the debt ceiling, and then have the trader part of the attackers have all the DAI for the auctions, because everyone else would be like, hey, I was expecting that DAI to be there, and it's not, because it's not there. Also, coupled with this, I could see, like, let's say I have 50 million in negative DAI exposure, because I've just been slowly collecting DAI puts. That gives me a hedged position to go very long on the DAI market. So now, like, since I have so much, I have 50 million negative exposure, I could collect maybe 30 million DAI in playing this attack ahead of time. So like whenever ETH crashes, I don't have to have that capital to make ETH crash. I just know it's going to happen eventually, right? And I'm just acquiring puts this whole time, and also acquiring DAI the whole time with the expectation of filling up the debt ceiling. So that was kind of my thought.
So to unpack that a little bit, is a component of this attack the idea that when the crash happens, the sort of DAI required to bid is being hoarded off market somewhere, and there's like a cabal that's trying to sort of keep liquidity artificially low? Is that, did I understand that as a component, or am I misinterpreting?
That could be part of it. Yes, that would be the even worst case scenario, but it doesn't have to be, because it doesn't have to be a cabal, because you can acquire a huge amounts of negative exposure, because the price right now has been 0.01. So you've just been able to stack negative puts, or puts on puts on puts that have been sold to us by Maker Protocol. I don't know if that makes sense. The puts I'm talking about are adding USDC and minting DAI at 1, but then you're selling it for like very close to 0.01.
So concretely, you mean someone who has taken USDC, minted DAI, sold above 1, so that person doesn't have DAI anymore, but if DAI ever should drop below $1, they might have a profitable unwinding opportunity.
Well, I think, so let me try to interject here. I think what he's trying to say is that somebody is hoarding DAI, and that DAI is needed for the auctions, right? The way to theoretically counter this attack is increasing the USDCA debt ceiling. Another possible way is there already exists USDC-B vaults with an extremely high interest rate, or sorry, stability fee. That is there kind of probably for emergency measures, right? So that's another way that people could mint DAI in an emergency. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just around hoarding DAI, I mean, you can hoard DAI in the present system, and it's a much worse attack than it is in the new liquidation system, because in the new liquidation system, you can take advantage of DAI across the ecosystem. You can do flash lending, much so. The liquidity should strictly be better, or a harder and more costly attack with liquidations 2.0 in place. And you really have to, especially as the DAI supply continues to grow, you have to really ask, how feasible is that attack for someone to pull off? And then, like Akash said, you'll have collaterals like USDCB that can be used for very short-term liquidity in a crunch where there isn't cheaper liquidity available, because you're only going to have that position open for a short time. But it wouldn't necessarily be useful to...
My main point is that the price time curve needs to allow governance to adjust for more ceiling room in case that attack would happen.
Yeah, that's a matter of how quickly does the price go from some high level to some low level, and it's also is there a phase transition within the price curve where if it's dropped a certain amount, does it start dropping significantly more slowly? The price curves are set up to have endpoints of if the price drops by a certain amount or a certain amount of time has passed, the auction has to be reset based on current OSM prices. But ultimately, this one comes down very much to risk parameter setting.
Jose, did you have a question? Oh, okay. If you ask it in the sidebar, we'll try and read it out.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can also just type it.
Question about USDC liquidations. Are they going to be turned on before liquidations 2.0?
I don't know. Ask governance.
I would expect not, but I mean, I think Pramesh is here, right? Pramesh could cover this as well. Is Pramesh here?
Pramesh is here. Yeah, maybe we should go. We could go over quickly, just what would the pros and cons of that be, and why would we do that? I have no idea whether we'll actually do it. I can give my personal opinion, which is that we probably shouldn't, because there's no real reason to liquidate those positions right now. They're sort of they represent potential profit for the protocol if DAI ever goes, significantly, as low below $1 as it needs to go for those to unwind. And so there's no like real pressing need. So long as we aren't spending the surplus buffer, we don't really have an unbacked debt situation. So long as we keep all the fees sort of in that limbo state of we haven't spent them yet, so we can cover bad debt with them if we need to. So from my perspective, there's not a pressing need, but that doesn't really count for much in the greater scheme of governance things. So open question.
Yeah, sorry guys, I was muted. I totally agree. I actually wrote about this today. So why would you turn the fees off and turn on liquidations now when you can potentially earn much more? So there's this idea that we could just, leave them running, and then once we touch 100% collateralization ratio, we could disable them and then limit debt ceiling to 0 and then open another similar vault type. So for all the new vaults being opened, we can still charge something. But yeah, there are pros and cons. I've actually written about it today on the forum post, but I really wouldn't go into it too much. But I have another question. So I've read the forum post, and I was missing like a really simple list of governance parameters needed for liquidations 2.0, because I imagine there's a bit less of them. And I know there's this price curve, probably the most important one, but I guess there are others as well. And it wasn't completely clear to me which ones are they.
Yeah, I would second that, and saying having a list of parameters we need to set would be good.
Yep, we have a ticket that'll, once we've hit what we think is going to be code complete, we'll send that whole list of parameters and a nice little description off of what each one of them
I mean, we can also start a running list somewhere with the understanding that it's not necessarily finalized, and that might even be a good thing because there might be some feedback of, well, we'd like, to see different parameters for this reason or that reason. So yeah. If you're okay with potentially not final parameters, which I think might even be better because then you still have the opportunity to get feedback on them, I think we could make that happen.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's worth hosting an open call just like this one, like in office hours, to discuss the risk parameters. Or maybe we can do that in another public call. But I think that's a good idea as well, since that just has such a massive effect on the attack vectors and protecting us against different attacks.
Okay, I'm gonna put that down on a list, and I'll make sure we get that call out at some point.
Yeah, and maybe even we can get the guys from Gauntlet on. I think that would be great.
I do have one more question, if I may, involving the bark. So in the existing auction system, and it won't really change with Liquidations 2.0, there are a lot of resources required to detect opportunities to kick off a new auction. And thus far, there hasn't really been much incentive in calling the kick, right? You have to maintain all of your infrastructure and constantly monitor liquidation ratios of vaults. Is there any thoughts about having some sort of incentive to call bark to kick off a new auction?
That was one of the things I called out in my preamble. Our current thinking is that, we're not 100% sure. So we're just going to add something to it. And if governance doesn't want to use it, they don't have to. I think the sort of like tentative first way we try to do it is maybe like a small DAI reward. Basically you would call suck, which, well, I'm getting a little technical if you don't know the Val APIs, but basically that would be a thing where you would give some DAI to someone sort of up front and create a little debt on the back end. And since there's like a large liquidation penalty on the auction, then theoretically that with high probability gets covered. So it's just basically MKR holders subsidizing liquidations with some sort of DAI reward. But there are other ways you could imagine doing that. You could imagine using a gas refund. You could imagine just shaving off a chunk of the collateral and giving it to the caller of Mark, et cetera. So very interested to hear if people have like specific thoughts on how that should be done or how it would work well. But our current idea is to add something so that it's there if we need it.
Suck seems like the simplest way of doing it.
Yeah, but by the way, so to this point, even with the current auction system or the future auction system, the basic fundamental problem I see is you need one honest actor, right? If you have one honest auction participant, then everyone else has to participate honestly and they're putting up legitimate bids. But I could easily see, like, either through one player disincentivizing all the other players, that it somehow ends up in a situation where one player controls everything and then can eventually become dishonest. So I guess, how do you address that question?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So, so outside of the incentive around whether or not we incentivize somebody to call bark, let's assume like the auction's actually kicked off. The cost to manage that auction, just even as like a backstop, is so insanely low now, because you're going to be able to flash lend the collateral that's out for auction, find a circuit, and return the die for it. That even it would take almost nothing even for someone to just run the infrastructure to do that particular bit, and they would probably get a profit if they set the parameters right. So I think we're going to have a much easier time with honest auction participant, that problem, because I agree that problem is like a real problem. It's especially a problem under our current auction system. I don't think it's going to be as much of a problem under the new one, because of that like zero cost of capital to bid on auctions. Just makes it it's easy to just run a keeper that does
it's mostly
this.
the initial integration also, right? Like now the auction model is much simpler. It's just an offer sitting there and you can accept it, and then you can arrange your arbitrage whichever way you want. So once it's integrated, and if you are running like an arbitrage infrastructure anyway, I would imagine that like the maker auction participation module it would take up a few bytes in your runtime memory, and that would be it. That would be the cost of the running the infrastructure, which is as close to zero as you can get. So
there's the gas cost of kicking off the initial auction, which I think is really at play here.
That's separate, right? That's really separate.
No, well, that's what I was referring to, though. Like, for example, if a UI is created for this, would that UI that exposes these auctions to a larger audience, would that be doing the work of biting? And would there be some service behind that finds opportunities to bite and then?
Yeah, but but that got recognized, and we're saying, well, we can add a die rewards for that. So that would be the solution for that.
Okay.
And assuming that, I think you're good.
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic question is like, is someone incentivized to actually perform liquidations? And I mean, I think even without an incentive like we were talking about, it's actually not clear to me that there wouldn't be an incentive, because the idea is that somebody participates in the if it does get liquidated, someone's going to participate in the arbitrage opportunity. And so, if you're winning often enough, it's worth it for you to take the chance and trigger it. And then there are also things like DEX aggregators that want to offer the best possible prices to their users, which means having the best possible, range of liquidity to choose from. And so maybe there's an incentive there to trigger liquidations, because it's good to have, more options for your aggregator. But yeah,
I would also recommend we could use a system surplus to use that. We could be running the system could running its own auction keeper to set things off, and using the system surplus to go do it. So that could be there for an honest
That was
actor.
essentially the suck suggestion of giving a die reward.
Okay.
One more detail to add there. So large part of it is probably of the cost, of running that infrastructure is probably monitoring the which vaults are underwater. But that, there will be data APIs that will readily provide that information. And I think that's one assumption that we can make, that at least in the long run, these will be available, right? So that cost might actually already be minimized. So yeah, I still think we should definitely consider the extra rewards for kicking off auctions, but
right. So
I don't
might
think it will be that big.
You're thinking this, but I just want to point it out again, which is there is some probability of an actor who is nefarious who would overbid, in some sense, always overpay to drive out participation.
No,
right?
no, because once the initial integration is done, there would be no cost to participating. That's the reason why you can drive out players in the ecosystem today, is because it's costing you money to keep your keeper online, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that cost would be reduced to virtually zero. So yeah, I think the best defense you can probably get is with a system like the one that is being proposed.
Can you define zero, please?
Yeah, what I was saying, what it will cost you, and this is like, I'm saying virtually zero because I'm an engineer and I need to be precise, but it would cost you a few bytes of memory in your computer that is running anyway. So it's zero for all practical intents and purposes.
To be clear, the difference here is that the BARC is actually expensive infrastructure. So we could add an incentive to call the BARC, but bidding on an open auction, once it's out there, once it's been kicked, is going to be extremely cheap. So that's the cost that's like near zero. And I think addresses the issue of like bad actors and auctions, trying to like control those auctions. Because it's really going to cost almost nothing to run a keeper that just manages the auctions it can find. The BARC still, there's an expense there. And it's slightly worse than the auctions today. So if we bite today, usually the person that's going to bite gets the, they can call bite, which calls kick, and then they can get their first like tend in, so they get to set the price of the auction. So there's a pretty good incentive.
They have first bid privilege.
Yeah, they get first bid privilege, which gives
English
them
way to say that.
and a strong incentive. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just going to bring this point up again. So I generally agree with you that it is going to be free, but let's be honest here. It is not completely free, right? So me as an independent person who wants to bid on these things has to have, a computer running somewhere, has to have access to a node that actually costs money. There is some infrastructure costs, and maybe there are arbitrage people that are constantly running other stuff anyway, where this is incremental zero cost to them, and that's my point. Correct. But again, I don't know necessarily how to guarantee that we just don't get, and again, when I say we, I mean the maker token holder gets into a bad situation. But
well, so even in that case, presenting a Web3 interface anywhere for these auctions is truly sort of near zero. So you'd be able to see them in real time. You don't need any infrastructure other than a MetaMask wallet, and
right. So that's what I'm arguing. So if you can at least try to, I don't know who's in charge of that, but try to guarantee that at worst case, some manual human being can bid on these auctions through a GUI, I would push for that.
There is a GUI included in the initial scope. So the Oasis team will build one. The one thing it won't do, it won't be complete, I believe, in the way that you say it. But you will be able to bid, but it will be write only. You'll have to use like another interface to see which auctions are going on. So the monitoring aspect of it is not included. But I guess that can be done too.
Yeah, so I would, I know it's painful, but I think for the maker token holder to be safe, I think it's good for that to exist.
Yeah, I totally agree. The more indexes into this and the more participants we can bring to these auctions, the better it is for maker holders.
In principle, I definitely agree too. The thing here is I think that we're really scared of that scenario now because we got confronted with it. And the likelihood of that happening is reduced to such an extent that I think that there are probably other problems that will be bigger than this one, and we're kind of we're blinded by something that we had a very bad experience with. But in principle, I definitely agree that you know, all the necessary precautions should be taken. That
Well,
there is.
so let me throw out another use case, and I can see you saying like this is useless because the bots are going to win these auctions anyway. What's the point of building all this manual GUI? And I'll counter it with, this gives an opportunity for manual humans to buy large liquidity. So what I'm claiming is that manual humans might be willing to pay a higher price to access these large blocks, whereas a bot just doing pure arbitrage.
Yeah, but I actually agree with that, and that UI will be available.
We're probably hitting the end of our time, even with the delays for setting the meeting up. I just wanted to say, you know, one last piece on my part, which is everyone has like a pretty good idea of what the auctions look like. And now I want everyone to put their black hats on and really think about how they would take advantage of this existing auction mechanism, what they would do if they were trying to profit on it, if they were trying to like win it over on other users, take advantage of it. So over the next few weeks, really think about ways that you could exploit this. Maybe something will come to you in your sleep or tomorrow. You can just sort of bring it up in the chat, and because who knows, you might find something that we haven't thought of.
On another note, I don't know if this is important or not, but as Kurt was mentioning earlier, the idea of adding an adjustable parameter is way easier kind of thinking of things beforehand than doing it after the fact. So whether that be dealing with the bark and adding an additional fee to the person who calls bark, and or even to the auction bidder or auction winner and just giving them a handout, us adding that variable that determines whether or not they should receive an additional fee might be a good idea, even if we set it to 0 and never use it, just in the event that we need to mess with those mechanics and change those things.
With an understanding that it could have a gas cost, so there's a consideration there as well.
Yeah, generally, you know, the most gas intensive thing is storage, and any configuration variable is going to entail at least, you know, one storage read to check what the value is. On the other hand, like it's probably, you know, there are already a lot of storage reads and writes in this logic. And if it's a thing that's like an incentive mechanism, obviously the incentive can cover the additional gas cost. But yeah, certainly if we can determine any parameters that we don't need, you know, we should remove them to help with the gas. But yeah, in the case of these incentives, you know, they can just cover it.
Yeah, and I mean, I would always, if I'm as a maker holder, right, or on behalf of maker holders, I would always rather have the system pay a little bit more upfront, which if it can, I think the arbitrage already kind of does this, but if it can, again, add a little bit more incentive to encourage that participants show, I'd much rather have the system lose a little bit of capital over time that way, you know, and have that be withdrawn from the fees we collect, just to ensure that that's there. And, you know, we don't have to worry about that, and don't have to worry about a Black Thursday event or people trying to fuck with auction participation altogether by performing a bad action or by forcing other people to not participate because I'm overbidding, things of that nature, or getting it right at fair market value. So I don't know, that's what I would always prefer, is that the system pay out just a little bit more, or have the option to pay out a little bit more there, just to ensure that we don't have to ever experience that again.
Basically accepting a small ongoing cost to reduce the probability of, you know, large black swan events.
Exactly. Yeah, just to make us all sleep at night.
It's like an insurance policy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anything else?
All right. Yeah, I think we're good. If anybody's got anything else.
Thank you, guys. And hopefully
Yep.
do another office hours pretty quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like we need one focused on maybe risk parameter deep dives.
Yep.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.